"Nobody wants the fat one," they laughed. But then the room froze when an Amish man stood tall and said, "Now that's a woman." In a dusty frontier town, a woman long mocked and shamed is thrust into a marriage no one expected. But what begins as a moment of mercy soon collides with secrets that could tear the town apart. The new husband isn't just a quiet farmer, he's been sent west to protect the land and the water that greedy men will kill to control. And his bold choice of bride makes her the target of every whisper, every cruel sneer, every threat. As violence rises and loyalties are tested, this so-called unwanted woman must find the courage to fight for her husband, her people, and her own worth. When the gunsmoke clears, will she remain the outcast they mocked or become the strength that saves them all? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the dusty Colorado street as townsfolk gathered for the charity marriage auction. The air hung heavy with the mingled scents of horse sweat, fresh-baked pies, and the sweet perfume the younger sisters had dabbed behind their ears. 6 of the orphaned girls stood hopefully at the front, their carefully mended dresses in shining, eyes drawing admiring glances from potential suitors. But Miriam, the eldest at nearly 30, stood apart. Her broad shoulders and work-roughened hands spoke of years spent raising her sisters after their parents' passing. While the younger ones had time for ribbons and curls, she'd been too busy cooking, cleaning, and ensuring they all survived. Now she watched, heart aching, as the crowd's attention fell adoringly on her prettier sisters. The auctioneer, a round-faced man with a booming voice, worked his way through the lineup. Next up, we have Sweet Sarah, just 17 and already the finest seamstress in 3 counties. Bids flew fast for Sarah, her delicate features flushing pink with pleasure. Miriam's shoulders hunched further with each sister sold. When only she remained, the auctioneer's enthusiasm notably dimmed. "Well, folks, lastly we have Miriam." A snicker rippled through the crowd. "Nobody wants the fat one." Someone called out, triggering cruel laughter. Miriam's cheeks burned as she stared at her worn boots, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. "Might make a good pack mule." Another voice jeered. Miriam's eyes stung with unshed tears as she clenched her calloused hands into fists, preparing to flee this public humiliation. Then a deep, steady voice cut through the mockery. "Now that's a woman." The crowd fell silent, parting to reveal a tall figure in a plain black coat and broad-brimmed hat. Charles Stoltzfus stood straight-backed and dignified, his quiet authority drawing all eyes. The Amish widower from Pennsylvania had arrived in town just days before, sent by his elders to help mediate water rights disputes. "Sir?" The auctioneer blinked in surprise. "Those hands have known honest work," Charles continued, his calm gaze meeting Miriam's startled one. "That strength comes from putting others first. There's more beauty in such sacrifice than in any painted face." Miriam barely breathed, scarcely daring to believe someone could see past her plain features to recognize the years of devotion that had shaped her body and spirit. "I'll start the bidding at $5, Charles stated firmly, silencing the last few scattered snickers. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $5 for Miriam, do I hear 6? The crowd stayed quiet now, watching as Charles Stoltzfus stepped forward. His boots left precise prints in the dust as he approached the platform where Miriam stood trembling. "Going once," the auctioneer called. Charles's steady eyes never left Miriam's face. "Going twice," he extended his hand to her. Palm up, a gesture of respect, not possession. "Sold to Mr. Stoltzfus." Miriam stared at his offered hand, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. This man, with his quiet dignity and clear-eyed honesty, had just defended her worth in front of the entire town. Yet doubt still whispered in her mind. Was this real, or would the cruelty return once they were away from watching eyes? But as she placed her trembling hand in his, Charles's gentle grip was firm and sure. He helped her down from the platform with the same careful respect he'd shown in his words. Together, they walked away from the murmuring crowd, their steps matching as the evening shadows lengthened across the dusty street behind them. The townsfolk buzzed with shocked whispers about the strange Amish widower who had chosen the plain, strong sister over all the pretty ones. But Charles seemed unbothered by their gossip, leading Miriam with quiet purpose toward whatever future they might build together. As they reached the end of the street, Miriam dared a glance at his profile, struck by the peace in his expression. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt something unfamiliar flutter in her chest, not the weary resignation she'd grown used to, but a tentative, fragile hope. The boarding house dining room glowed with warmth from oil lamps as Charles pulled out a chair for Miriam. The familiar scents of beef stew and fresh cornbread filled the air, but everything else felt strange and new. Her stomach churned with nervous energy as she settled at the corner table, away from the curious stares of other diners. "Miss Hampton serves the best stew in 3 counties," Charles said, his voice carrying the same gentle steadiness it had shown at the auction. He waited for her to be seated before taking his own chair, his movements deliberate and careful. Miriam picked up her spoon with trembling fingers. "Thank you for," she began, then faltered. "For what? For buying her? For stopping the mockery?" The words stuck in her throat. "I should tell you about Sarah," Charles said quietly, breaking the awkward silence. "My first wife." Miriam's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Here it comes, she thought. The comparison to a prettier woman, the explanation of why he had settled for less. But Charles's next words surprised her. She was so frail, the wind could nearly blow her over. His eyes held a distant sadness. "I tried to protect her, but her body was never strong enough for frontier life. When the fever came," he shook his head slowly, "I have prayed long for a partner with strength, someone who could stand beside me through all the challenges this land brings." Heat crept into Miriam's cheeks as his meaning became clear. Was he saying her sturdiness was a blessing rather than a burden? She had spent so many years being mocked for her size that the idea seemed impossible to grasp. A commotion at the door drew their attention. Her sisters burst in, faces flushed with excitement and worry. They crowded around the table, their voices overlapping. "Miriam, are you truly leaving tomorrow? What should we pack? Will you be far?" Charles stood smoothly, gesturing to the empty chairs. "Join us, please. There is plenty of stew." The younger girls hesitated, then sat. Mary, the second eldest, wrung her hands. "We've never been apart before. You'll be settled with your own husband soon," Miriam reminded them, though her heart ached at the thought of separation. As they finished their meal, the noise from the saloon across the street grew rowdier. Charles frowned at the sound of break-in glass and drunken shouts. "I'll escort you all upstairs," he said firmly. "It's not safe for young women alone at this hour." He stood guard as they climbed the narrow stairs to their shared room, his tall figure a barrier between them and any trouble. Miriam felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest at his protective presence. "I'll return at dawn," he told her softly. "Rest well. Alone in the darkness later." Miriam listened to her sister's steady breathing and tried to make sense of the day's events. "Lord," she whispered, "why would you give me to a man so different from anyone I've known? His ways are strange to me, so calm, so certain." She touched her cheeks, still warm from his kind words at supper. "Is this truly your plan?" Morning came too quickly. Her sisters helped fold her few belongings into the small trunk that had been her mother's. Each dress and apron was carefully packed, along with the family photographs wrapped in soft cloth. The whole town seemed to have gathered to watch as Charles hitched his team to the wagon. Miriam clutched her Bible and her mother's woolen shawl, trying to ignore the whispers that followed her down the boarding house steps. "I still can't believe he chose her," someone muttered. "Guess even the Amish have odd tastes," another replied with a snicker. But Charles's steady presence beside her made the words sting less than they once had. He helped her up onto the wagon seat with the same careful respect he had shown since their first meeting. The sisters crowded close for final embraces, tears flowing freely now. "Write to us," they pleaded. "Tell us everything." "I will," Miriam promised, holding each one close. "Be good to each other." Charles picked up the reins, and the wagon began to roll forward. Miriam watched the dusty town grow smaller, her sisters' waving figures becoming mere specks in the distance. The Bible in her lap and the shawl around her shoulders were all she had left of her old life as they set out toward whatever future awaited them at Charles's homestead. The wagon wheels turned steadily through the afternoon heat, each rotation marking time in squeaks and groans. Dust rose in thin clouds around the horses' hooves as they followed the rutted trail away from town. The familiar sounds of life, clattering dishes from the boarding house, children's shouts, and the blacksmith's hammer, faded into the vast quiet of the open prairie. Miriam sat straight-backed on the wooden seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The silence between them stretched long, broken only by the jingling of harness leather and the steady clip-clop of hooves. Her new husband seemed content with the quiet, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The sun had crossed half the sky when Charles finally spoke, lifting one hand from the reins to point toward a distant ridge crowned with pine trees. "That ridge there, the Ute people made their camps there, before the treaties moved them south." His voice carried a note of sadness. "Good people. Treated the land with respect." Miriam nodded, studying the landscape with growing curiosity. The rolling hills stretched endlessly, dotted with clusters of aspen trees that shimmered silver green in the afternoon light. It was beautiful, but so different from the crowded streets she'd known. "There's the creek," Charles continued, gesturing to where water glinted in the sunlight. "Feeds right down into the valley. Never runs dry, even in August." He handled the reins with practiced ease as they followed the creek's winding path. The homestead's just beyond that next rise. Miriam's throat tightened as they crested the hill. Below them lay a modest cabin with whitewashed walls that gleamed in the late sunlight. A sturdy barn stood nearby, its red paint weathered but neat. Behind the buildings, ordered rows of beans and corn stretched toward the creek, their leaves dark green against the tawny prairie grass. Charles guided the wagon to a stop near the cabin's door. "Welcome home," he said quietly, climbing down. He moved to help her, but Miriam was already swinging herself down from the high seat. Her feet hit the packed earth with a solid thump. When she reached for her trunk, Charles stepped forward, but she had already lifted it easily from the wagon bed. A flash of approval crossed his face at her show of strength. "The door's unlatched," he said, turning to unhitch the horses. Miriam pushed the door open with her shoulder, trunk balanced against her hip. The cabin's interior smelled of fresh-cut pine boards and lamp oil. A iron cookstove sat against one wall, its pipe rising through the ceiling. A simple table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Shelves lined with books and tin cans stretched along another wall. Everything was plain but meticulously clean. She set her trunk down near the wall, uncertain where it should go. Through the window, she watched Charles leading the horses to the barn, his movements sure and practiced. The sun was setting now, painting the white cabin walls gold. Charles returned as dusk was settling in. He lit the lamp that hung from a ceiling beam, its gentle glow filling the cabin with dancing shadows. From a cupboard, he brought out a loaf of bread and a wheel of cheese, setting them on the table with careful precision. "It's not much," he said, pulling out a chair for her. "Tomorrow we can prepare something more fitting." Miriam sat, smoothing her skirts nervously. Charles remained standing, closing his eyes and folding his hands. "Lord," he prayed, his voice deep and reverent, "we thank you for this food, for this home, and for bringing Miriam safely here. Bless this beginning. Amen." The sound of her name in his prayer startled her. In all the years of family prayers at the boarding house, she'd never been singled out for blessing. Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in her chest. They ate in comfortable silence, the cheese sharp and the bread still fresh. Outside, a chorus of coyotes began their nightly song, their haunting calls echoing across the valley. Miriam shivered slightly at the wild sound. "They keep to themselves," Charles assured her, noticing her reaction. "Mostly hunt rabbits in the creek bottom." After the simple meal, Charles showed her where he'd laid out a bedroll in the corner, complete with clean blankets and a feather pillow. "I'll sleep in the barn until we can properly arrange things," he said quietly, gathering what he needed for the night. Alone in the cabin, Miriam changed into her nightdress and slipped under the blankets. The bedroll was comfortable enough, but she lay awake, listening to the strange night sounds, the creak of settling logs, the whisper of wind through prairie grass, the distant coyotes. She wondered if she would ever feel truly at home here, in this place so far from everything she'd known. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the dark sky like diamonds on black velvet, more than she'd ever seen in town. Their steady light offered a strange comfort as she finally drifted toward sleep. Her first night as Charles Stoltzfus's wife. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt street as Charles and Miriam's wagon rolled toward the white-painted church. The wooden steps creaked under their feet as they climbed to the porch, where clusters of townspeople stood in their Sunday best. Miriam clutched Charles's arm, drawing strength from his steady presence. Inside, sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The wooden pews gleamed from years of polish and use. As Charles and Miriam made their way down the center aisle, whispers rustled like autumn leaves. Miriam kept her eyes forward, though her cheeks burned at the murmurs that followed their progress. "Bless my soul. She takes up half the bench," someone tittered behind a hymnal. They settled into a pew near the middle, and Miriam smoothed her plain dress, conscious of every eye upon them. Charles sat tall beside her, his familiar black hat resting on his knee. The simple band on her finger caught the light, and she twisted it nervously. Reverend Pike stood at the pulpit, his weathered face solemn as he opened his Bible. His sermon text came from 2 Corinthians, "And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." The words pierced Miriam's heart like arrows. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears as the preacher spoke of how God uses the unlikely and overlooked to accomplish his purposes. Though she knew the message wasn't meant specifically for her, each word seemed to speak directly to her soul's deepest hurts. After the final hymn, the congregation spilled out into the churchyard. Charles moved easily among the townspeople, extending friendly greetings in his quiet way. Miriam stood slightly apart, watching as he spoke with a group of men about the summer's drought. "Poor man," came a sharp whisper from behind her. "Imagine being saddled with that one. That size. She struggles something fierce bearing children," a ranch wife added, her voice carrying clearly to Miriam's ears. "If she can at all," the words struck like physical blows. Miriam's face flamed scarlet, and she turned away, pretending to study the distant mountains. The cool morning air had grown stifling, and her collar felt too tight around her throat. The wagon ride home stretched long and quiet. Wind rustled through the prairie grass, and meadowlarks called from fence posts along the rutted road. Charles glanced at his wife's face, noting the tears she tried to hide. "Something's troubling you," he said softly, letting the reins slack. Miriam wiped her cheeks quickly. "It's nothing." Charles was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "A woman is more than a body. She's a heart that keeps the home alive." The simple truth of his words settled over Miriam like a warm shawl. She straightened slightly, drawing in a deep breath of the sage-scented air. That evening, they shared a simple supper of rabbit stew, the silence between them more comfortable than before. The tin spoons clinked against their bowls, and the lamplight cast warm shadows on the cabin walls. Though few words passed between them, something had shifted, a deeper understanding perhaps, or the first tender shoots of trust taking root. After the dishes were dried and put away, Miriam sat in the chair by the window. The leather binding of her Bible was smooth and familiar in her hands as she turned to 1 Samuel. The words brought comfort, for the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the wooden shutters against the cabin walls. But inside, the lamp burned steady and bright. Miriam looked across at Charles, who sat mending a piece of harness by the fire. His presence felt like an anchor, solid and true against the storm of doubt and judgment they had weathered that day. A fragile peace settled over the cabin, as delicate as spider silk but growing stronger with each passing moment. Perhaps, Miriam thought, this was how belonging began, not with grand gestures or sudden changes, but in quiet moments of understanding, in gentle words spoken with conviction, in the steady warmth of acceptance freely given. The shutters rattled again, but Miriam barely noticed. Her finger traced the well-worn verse in her Bible, and for the first time since the auction, she felt something like hope stirring in her heart. Like hope stirring in her heart. The week unfolded in a rhythm of work and quiet companionship. Dawn found Miriam at the wooden table, flour dusting her arms as she learned to knead bread dough the way Charles preferred it. Her strong hands worked the mass until it grew smooth and elastic, ready for rising. The satisfaction of seeing golden loaves emerge from the iron stove made her smile, especially when Charles nodded approval at their perfect crust out in the garden. Rows of beans needed constant attention. Miriam worked alongside Charles, her broad shoulders strong enough for the task of weeding and harvesting. The late summer sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat dampened her dress, but she never complained. When Charles brought her a dipper of cool well water, his words were simple but sincere. "You work hard, Miriam." "I'm grateful." The mending basket kept her hands busy in the evenings. She discovered Charles had been wearing shirts with frayed cuffs and missing buttons. By lamplight, she repaired each piece carefully, adding neat rows of stitches that would last through many washings. One warm afternoon, as Miriam hung fresh laundry on the line, she heard the crunch of footsteps approaching. A Ute woman appeared around the corner of the cabin, cradling a small boy in her arms. The woman's face was drawn with worry, and the child's cheeks blazed with fever. "Please," the woman said softly, her voice trembling. "I am a hyena. My grandson burns with sickness. The others say Charles Stoltzfus helps our people." Charles emerged from the barn, taking in the situation quickly. "The boy needs a doctor," he said, already striding toward the wagon. "Miriam, come with us." The ride to town was tense. The child whimpered in his grandmother's arms, his small face flushed and sweating. Miriam watched Ahiana whisper soothing words in her native tongue, stroking the boy's dark hair with gentle fingers. Dr. Mason's office stood on the main street, its white paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. The bell jangled as they entered, and the doctor looked up from his desk. His expression hardened when he saw Ahiana and the child. "I don't waste medicine on Indians," he said flatly. Turning back to his papers, the words hung in the air like smoke. Miriam felt something rise in her chest, a familiar hurt transformed into unexpected courage. She stepped forward, her voice stronger than she knew it could be. "That child is burning with fever," she said, meeting the doctor's startled gaze. "Would you let him suffer because of who his people are? What kind of healer turns away the sick?" Several townspeople had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. Their whispers filled the small office. "Every child is precious to God," Miriam continued, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "What would Jesus do, seeing this little one in pain?" Color rose in Dr. Mason's face. He glanced at the watching crowd, then at the suffering child. With a grunt, he stood and gestured toward the examination room. "Bring him in," he muttered. "But don't expect special treatment." Ahiana hurried forward with her grandson, relief visible in every line of her body. As she passed Miriam, she reached out and clasped her hand briefly, gratitude shining in her dark eyes. The sun was setting by the time they left town, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. The boy's fever had broken under the doctor's reluctant ministrations, and he slept peacefully in his grandmother's embrace. Behind them, Miriam could still hear the buzz of gossip about her boldness. The wagon wheels creaked steadily on the homeward trail. Miriam's heart still raced when she thought of her own daring. She had never spoken so forcefully to anyone before, let alone a respected town doctor. The memory made her tremble, but when she glanced at Charles, she found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was pride in his eyes and something warmer, a deep admiration that touched places in her heart long closed to hope. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Miriam felt the day's events settle into place like stones in a foundation. Perhaps courage, like belonging, could grow from small beginnings. Perhaps she was stronger than she had ever dared to believe. Over the next days, the small boy's fever broke like ice melting in spring. A Hannah appeared each morning, carrying gifts that spoke of gratitude without words. One day it was fresh venison, wrapped carefully in leaves. The next brought an armload of dry firewood, perfectly split for the cook stove. At first, Miriam felt awkward accepting such generosity. "You needn't bring anything," she said softly one morning. A hyena's dark eyes met hers steadily. "Among my people, we share what we have. It brings honor to both giver and receiver." The wisdom in those words touched something in Miriam's heart. Soon she found herself setting an extra plate at the noon meal, watching with quiet joy as Ayana savored her fresh bread and stew. One bright morning, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the cabin walls. Ahina had brought her young nieces, their eyes bright with curiosity. The smallest one, no more than 6 years old, pointed at Miriam's bread dough rising in its bowl. "Would you like to learn?" Miriam asked, surprising herself with the offer. The girls nodded eagerly. Soon small hands were covered in flour as Miriam showed them how to knead and shape the dough. Their giggles filled the kitchen when the youngest got flour on her nose. Miriam found herself humming an old hymn as they worked, and before long, the girls were trying to follow the tune. "Teach us?" the older girl asked shyly. Miriam's heart swelled. She sang the words slowly, showing them the simple melody of "Jesus loves me." Their sweet voices joined hers, stumbling at first, then growing more confident. The harmony of English and Ute accent blended like sunshine through leaves. Charles paused in the doorway, watching. His eyes held a warmth that made Miriam's cheeks flush. She caught him smiling more often now, especially when the cabin rang with children's voices. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Charles suggested a walk by the creek. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of wild sage. Water burbled over stones, a peaceful song in the gathering dusk. "I prayed long before coming west," Charles said quietly, his steps matching hers along the creek bank. "Ask God to send me a wife strong enough to bear burdens beside me." He paused, looking at her directly. "Not just physical strength, though you have that too. The strength to see past differences, to stand up for what's right." Miriam's heart quickened at his words. No one had ever valued her strength before. It had always been something to hide, to be ashamed of. But Charles spoke of it as a gift. "I never thought," she began, then stopped, emotion making her voice thick. "I never thought anyone would want me for who I am. God sees clearer than we do," Charles replied softly. "He knew what this place needed. What I needed." They walked back to the cabin as the first stars appeared. The lamplight welcomed them home, golden and warm against the deepening blue of evening. Instead of retiring immediately as was their custom, they sat at the kitchen table. Charles brought out his Bible, but tonight they talked more than read. Miriam found herself sharing memories of raising her sisters after their parents died. Charles spoke of his years alone after losing his first wife. The lamp flame danced as their words flowed easier than ever before, filling the once lonely cabin with new understanding. Later, Kneeling beside her bed, Miriam pressed her hands together in prayer. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sorrow. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for bringing me here. For showing me that being different isn't being wrong." The cabin creaked gently in the night wind. Through the window, moonlight silvered the garden where children had played that afternoon. On her work table lay tomorrow's bread dough, ready for little hands to learn. Her mending basket held not only Charles's shirts now, but small tears in the girls' dresses that Ahina had shyly asked her to fix. For the first time since she could remember, Miriam felt truly at home. Not just sheltered, but wanted. Not just accepted, but cherished. God had indeed worked in mysterious ways, turning an auction block humiliation into something beautiful and unexpected. Last thing she saw before sleep was the faint outline of Charles's hat hanging by the door, a silent reminder that she was no longer alone. Autumn painted the Colorado hills in shades of amber and russet. Dry leaves skittered across the dusty street as Charles guided their wagon into town. Miriam sat beside him, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. The meeting with the railroad agents loomed ahead, and tension rode with them like an unwelcome passenger. The town hall's wooden steps creaked under their feet as they entered. Inside, lamplight cast long shadows across the worn floorboards. Railroad men in dark suits occupied one side of the room, their faces set in hard lines. Charles took his seat at the rough-hewn table, Miriam settling quietly beside him. Henry Lasker, the railroad foreman, spread maps across the table's scarred surface. His finger jabbed at the blue line marking the water channel. "This here's progress, Mr. Stoltzfus. The railroad needs that water for the steam engines. We're prepared to pay handsomely." Charles shook his head, his voice steady. "The treaty guarantees water rights to the Ute people. Money cannot change what is right. Right?" Lasker's laugh held no humor. "What's right is bringing civilization to this wilderness. Your primitive notions about sharing with savages won't stop progress. The Ute were here first." Charles replied calmly. "Their children drink from that stream same as ours." One of the younger agents, red-faced with frustration, pointed at Miriam. "Fat wife, fat mouth. Seems like you both need learning about keeping quiet when your betters are talking." The insult struck like a slap. Miriam felt heat rise in her cheeks, rage flashing through her body. Her fingers tightened on Charles's arm, but she held her tongue. The silence that followed spoke louder than any retort. Charles stood slowly, his quiet dignity filling the room. "We are done here. The water stays as agreed in the treaty." The wagon ride home stretched long under heavy clouds. Wind rustled the dry corn stalks in their field, and the first cold drops of rain began to fall. Charles's shoulders sagged slightly as he guided the horses. "They will not stop," he said finally. "Their greed burns hot as fever. I fear it will end in violence." Miriam turned to face him, surprising them both with her fierce response. "Then we'll face it together." Her voice grew stronger. "God didn't bring us here to back down from what's right." Charles studied her face in the fading light, wonder replacing worry in his eyes. This was not the timid woman from the auction block. Here sat a partner ready to stand against the storm. At home, Miriam lit the lamps and stoked the cookstove. Her hands worked quickly, mixing flour and lard for pie crust. Soon, the cabin filled with the sweet scent of apple and cinnamon. She baked through the evening until 6 golden brown pies cooled on the windowsill. "What's all this for?" Charles asked, coming in from the barn. "For building bridges," Miriam replied. 2 for the Amish families down the valley. 2 for Ayanna to share with her people. And 2 for folks in town who might remember kindness spreads further than hate. The next morning, they delivered the pies. At the Amish homes, the women clasped Miriam's hands warmly. "We stand with you," they whispered. Ahina's eyes shone with tears as she accepted the gift. Understanding its deeper meaning. In town, Miriam chose carefully. She left one pie with the widow who ran the general store, another with the preacher's wife. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns. Some faces softened when they saw Miriam next, nodding in quiet greeting instead of turning away, but others grew darker with anger. Outside the saloon, men muttered about Indian lovers and strange folk who don't know their place. The railroad agents watched from their office window, their expressions storm cloud gray. That evening, Miriam stood in their doorway, watching the weather mirror the tension in town. Dark clouds rolled across the mountains, and the wind carried the sharp scent of coming rain. Thunder growled in the distance like an angry voice. Charles joined her, his hand finding hers. "You showed great strength today," he said softly. "Not just in staying silent when insulted, but in answering hatred with kindness." "I learned strength from you," Miriam replied, squeezing his hand. "And from Aiyana, who gives even when she has little." Perhaps that's what the railroad men fear most. Not that they'll lose the water, but that they'll see we're all God's children, worthy of respect. The first heavy drops began to fall as they stepped back inside. Lightning flashed across the hills, illuminating their small cabin, a beacon of warmth against the gathering dark. In both weather and men's hearts, Miriam sensed a storm building. But for the first time in her life, she felt ready to weather whatever came, standing beside a man who saw her true worth and among people who valued more than appearances. The first snow of the season powdered the mountain peaks like sifted flour, gleaming white against the deep blue Colorado sky. Miriam stood at the cabin door, watching her breath cloud in the crisp morning air. The sound of Charles's axe rang steady from behind the house, where a growing pile of split logs promised warmth for the winter ahead. Wrapping her shawl tighter, Miriam carried a tin cup of hot coffee to her husband. Charles paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. His strong hands accepted the cup gratefully, but Miriam noticed a slight tremor she hadn't seen before. "The woodpile grows well," she said, studying his face with concern. "Aye," Charles nodded, taking a deep drink. "Though there's more yet to split before the heavy snows come." Miriam rolled up her sleeves. "Then let me help." Before he could protest, she picked up the second axe they'd traded for at the general store. Her broad shoulders and strong arms made quick work of the smaller logs, and soon they fell into a steady rhythm together. The sun climbed higher when they spotted Hannah approaching through the golden grass, her grandson running ahead with the boundless energy of youth restored. The boy's cheeks were rosy with health, a far cry from the fever that had nearly claimed him weeks before. "Many hands make light work," Aiyana called out in greeting, already reaching for fallen logs to stack. Her grandson darted between them, gathering kindling into a basket. Charles lowered his axe, smiling. "Much obliged for the help, friend." They worked together through the afternoon, the pile of split wood growing steadily higher. The boy chattered in mixed Ute and English, teaching Miriam the names for things: axe, wood, sky, snow. His laughter rang clear across the yard, bridging the space between their different worlds. As evening drew near, Miriam stirred a pot of venison stew that Aiyana had brought, tender meat and wild roots rich with flavor. The cabin filled with warmth from the cook stove and the scent of fresh-baked bread. Around the rough-hewn table, they shared the meal by lamplight, passing bowls and breaking bread together. Aiyana taught them a Ute blessing, her hands moving in graceful gestures as she spoke of gratitude for food and friendship. The boy demonstrated each motion for them, grinning when they followed along. Charles offered a prayer in Pennsylvania Dutch, the strange word somehow fitting naturally alongside the Ute blessing. After supper, while Aiyana's grandson dozed by the fire, Charles suggested a walk to check on the animals one last time. The night air was sharp and clean, stars scattered like diamond dust across the vast Colorado sky. Their boots crunched on frozen grass as they made their way to the barn. Near the corral fence, Charles stopped. His voice was soft but clear in the still night. "I never told you something, Miriam." She turned to face him. his features gentle in the starlight. "That day at the auction," he continued, "when they called your name, I heard God speak plain as day." Charles's eyes held hers steadily. "He whispered to me, 'That one has strength enough for both of you.'" Miriam's breath caught. Tears spilled down her cheeks, warm against the cold air. All her life she'd been mocked for her size, her strength treated as something shameful. But here was God's truth through Charles's lips. Her strength had been a gift all along, meant for this very purpose. Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining. Together they stood silent under the vast sweep of stars, their bond deepening like a river cutting through stone. The moment stretched, holy and still, until Charles swayed slightly on his feet. "You're weary," Miriam said, steadying him with a firm hand. "These meetings with the railroad men," he shook his head. "They drain a body's spirit more than splitting wood." Miriam helped him back to the cabin, noting how he leaned on her strength without shame. Inside, she settled him in his chair while she banked the fire and saw to their guests' comfort. Ayanna gathered her sleeping grandson, exchanging knowing looks with Miriam before departing into the night dot as she helped Charles prepare for bed. Miriam's heart lifted in silent prayer. She asked God to protect this good man through whatever trials lay ahead, to grant him rest and renewal. Watching him sink into exhausted sleep, she remembered his words under the stars. Her strength had been God's gift, not just to her, but to Charles as well, and she would use it gladly to help carry his burdens. The night air hung, still and cold, when 3 sharp cracks split the darkness. Miriam bolted upright in her bedroll, heart pounding. The gunshots had come from the direction of the water channel, distant but clear. Charles was already pulling on his boots. "Stay inside," he whispered, but Miriam shook her head firmly. Together they stood watch at the window until dawn painted the sky in streaks of pale gold. As morning light crept across the valley, thundering hooves approached their cabin. It was young Jim, one of the Amish neighbors, his normally calm face tight with worry. "The water channel," he called out, reining his horse. "Railroad men destroyed the sluice gate last night, then blamed it on the Utes. The whole town's in an uproar." Charles's jaw clenched. "We'd best see for ourselves," he turned to Miriam. "Will you ride with me?" She was already reaching for her shawl. "Of course." They saddled their horses quickly, the morning air bitter with frost. Miriam's mount, usually steady, pranced nervously beneath her as they rode toward the channel. Her fingers were stiff with cold where they gripped the reins. The damage was worse than they'd feared. The wooden sluice gate lay splintered and broken, precious water spilling uselessly down the rocky slope. Fresh boot prints marked the mud, along with drops of oil from a rail lantern. "Look here," Charles said quietly, pointing to a scrap of blue cloth caught on a nail, the same shade as the railroad workers' uniforms. But before they could examine it closer, horses approached from both directions. From the west came 3 Ute men, their faces grave as they surveyed the destruction. From the east rode Deputy Walt Haskins with 2 officers, their hands hovering near their guns. "Just as we thought," Haskins sneered, jerking his chin toward the Ute men. "Caught them red-handed." "That's not true," Miriam said, her voice stronger than she felt. She stepped forward, forcing herself to meet Haskins's cold eyes. "We arrived first and found railroad evidence." The deputy's face darkened with rage. "You watch your mouth, woman." "Nobody asked for your opinion. My wife speaks truth," Charles said, moving to stand beside her. His calm voice carried authority. "We found a piece of railroad uniform caught here, and lamp oil in the mud. The Utes had no part in this destruction." One of the Ute men nodded solemnly. "We need this water same as you. Why would we break it?" But Haskins wasn't listening. His hand tightened on his gun belt as he glared at Miriam. "Seems that fat auction bride of yours has forgotten her place, Stultzfus. Better teach her to hold her tongue before she causes real trouble." Charles's shoulders stiffened, but his voice remained steady. "The only trouble here is false accusation, deputy. And my wife speaks with my full support." The tension crackled like lightning about to strike. Miriam's heart hammered, but she stood her ground. Finally, Haskins spat in the dirt and wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he called over his shoulder. "You're choosing the wrong side, Stoltzfus." They watched until the deputies disappeared around the bend. The Ute men conferred briefly with Charles in low voices, then rode away toward their camp. The morning sun had climbed higher, but its warmth couldn't touch the cold knot of fear in Miriam's chest. The ride home was silent, both lost in troubled thoughts. The cabin felt different now, less like a sanctuary, more like a target. Miriam's hands shook slightly as she prepared their evening meal. The familiar tasks of cutting vegetables and kneading bread offering little comfort. They ate without speaking, the only sound the scrape of spoons against bowls. Charles's face was drawn with worry, and he barely touched his food. The lamplight cast long shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel smaller, more vulnerable. After the dishes were done, Miriam knelt beside her bedroll. Her prayer came in desperate whispers, asking God to protect them from the storm she could feel gathering, to give them wisdom in the face of danger, to shield Charles from those who would harm him for standing up for truth. "Lord," she breathed, "grant us courage for whatever comes." Her fingers worked her worn Bible's pages, seeking comfort in its familiar verses. Outside, a coyote's lonely howl echoed across the darkening valley, and Miriam shivered, knowing that somewhere in that darkness, enemies were plotting against them. The setting sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor, as a plotting against them. The setting sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor, as longes were plotting against them. Miriam cleared away their simple supper dishes. Charles had ridden into town for a meeting with Reverend Pike, hoping to gain the preacher's support against the railroad schemes. Though she'd offered to accompany him, Charles had insisted she stay behind. "Best not to provoke them further tonight," he'd said softly, touching her cheek before mounting his horse. Now the cabin felt too quiet, too empty. Miriam tried to keep her hands busy with mending, but her eyes kept straying to the window. The lantern's flame flickered as she paced, casting wavering shadows on the whitewashed walls. Each hour that passed wound her nerves tighter. Outside, an owl called mournfully. Miriam wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped onto the porch, straining to hear hoofbeats in the darkness. The moon hung full and bright, turning the valley silver, but the road remained empty. Her stomach clenched with worry. The evening grew later, far beyond when Charles should have returned. Miriam's prayers became more urgent with each passing hour. "Lord, keep him safe," she whispered, over and over like a chant. Finally, near midnight, she heard horses approaching, more than one, moving slowly. Her heart leaped, then plummeted as she recognized young Jim's voice calling out in the darkness. "Miriam! Come quick!" She ran into the yard, lantern held high. The sight stopped her breath. Charles lay slumped across his saddle, supported by young Jim and another Amish neighbor, Jacob Miller. Blood matted Charles's hair and stained his black coat. Railroad men caught him leaving the preacher's house. Young Jim explained as they carefully lifted Charles down. "Beat him something terrible." Miriam's legs gave way as she reached for her husband. She fell to her knees in the dirt, cradling his bloodied head in her lap. His face was almost unrecognizable beneath the bruises and cuts. Each shallow breath he drew seemed to cause him pain. "Charles," she sobbed, stroking his cheek. "Oh, my Charles." Boots crunched in the gravel behind her. Deputy Haskins's shadow fell across them, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Well now, ain't that a shame? You should have married a man the town respected. Now you'll bury him." Miriam didn't look up, wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her tears. She heard him chuckle as he rode away, leaving them in the cold moonlight. Young Jim and Jacob helped carry Charles inside, laying him carefully on their bed. His skin felt clammy, his breathing ragged. Miriam's hands shook as she gathered clean cloths and water. "We'll fetch the doctor," Jacob offered. But Miriam shook her head. "He won't come. Not for us." She knew it in her bones. They were alone in this. After the men left, Miriam worked by lamplight, gently washing blood from Charles's face and hair. Each revealed injury broke her heart anew. His right eye was swollen shut, his lips split, dark bruises blooming across his ribs where the men's boots had. Struck, she whispered prayers through her tears as she worked, her voice hardly more than a breath. "Lord, give me strength. Don't take him from me. Please, please don't take him." Charles stirred once, trying to speak through cracked lips. Miriam pressed cool water to his mouth, her other hand gentle on his forehead. "Hush now," she soothed. "I'm here. I won't leave you." The night stretched endless. Miriam's back ached from sitting beside the bed, but she refused to rest. She watched each labored breath, counting them like precious gems. When his breathing grew more troubled, she propped him up with pillows, supporting him until it eased. Exhaustion pulled at her, but she fought it fiercely. Her prayers became a constant murmur, blending with the cabin's familiar creaks and settling sounds. Outside, coyotes yipped in the distance. Inside, the lantern's flame burned steady, holding back the darkness. Through her vigil, something shifted in Miriam's heart. The cabin that had once felt strange now seemed a sanctuary. Each humble board and beam held their story, their shared meals, their growing trust, their quiet moments of understanding. She couldn't lose him now, not when she'd finally found someone who saw her true worth. Dawn's first gray light found her still at Charles's side, her hand covering his. His breathing had steadied somewhat during the night, though fever flushed his cheeks. Miriam's body screamed for rest, but she kept her watch, determined to guard each precious breath. The morning sun crept across the floor, touching Charles's battered face with golden light. Miriam gazed at her husband, this good man who had chosen her, defended her, valued her strength. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but these were different tears of fierce love and fiercer determination. She wouldn't let the railroad men win. She wouldn't let them destroy what she and Charles had built. Most of all, she wouldn't let them break her faith in God, in Charles, or in herself. The first rays of sunrise painted the eastern sky when a soft knock echoed through the cabin. Miriam lifted her weary head from where she'd been dozing in the chair beside Charles's bed. Her back ached from the long night's vigil. "Come in," she called softly, recognizing Ahana's familiar pattern of knocking. The Ute woman entered quietly, her dark eyes widening at the sight of Charles's battered face. She crossed the room swiftly, laying a gentle hand on his forehead to check for fever. "The railroad men," Miriam explained, her voice rough from exhaustion. "They caught him alone after the meeting." Ahana's face hardened with understanding. She reached for Miriam's trembling hands, gripping them firmly. "Do not let your heart fall into darkness, sister. A strong woman holds up her people when men fall." The simple truth in those words pierced Miriam's fog of despair. She straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from Ahana's steady gaze. "What herbs do you need?" Ahana asked practically. "I will gather them." Together they made a list: willow bark for pain, yarrow for healing, sage for cleansing. Ahana departed swiftly, promising to return with other women to help. Miriam rose from her chair, new purpose flowing through her tired limbs. She went to the door and called young Jim, who had stayed to guard the homestead overnight. "Fetch the other Amish men," she instructed. "We'll need watches set, day and night, until Charles is stronger." Young Jim nodded, respect clear in his eyes. "Yes, ma'am. We'll arrange it." Through the morning, people began arriving. Amish men with rifles took up positions around the property. Ute women came bearing baskets of food and bundles of medicinal herbs. The cabin that had felt so lonely through the night now hummed with quiet. Activity. Charles stirred as Miriam bathed his face with cool water. His eyes fluttered open, one still swollen nearly shut, and focused on her face. "Miriam," he whispered, his split lip making speech difficult. She pressed her fingers gently against his hand. Save your strength, husband. But Charles persisted, squeezing her hand weakly. Thank you, he managed, before exhaustion pulled him back to sleep. Those two simple words filled Miriam's heart near to bursting. She bent and kissed his forehead, then returned to her tasks with renewed dedication. The days that followed tested every ounce of strength she possessed. Miriam worked tirelessly, sleeping only in short snatches beside Charles's bed. She learned from Ahina how to brew the healing herbs properly, how to bind poultices to draw out infection, how to ease fever with cool cloves and prayer. Each evening, as the sun set, Miriam gathered everyone in the cabin's main room. Amish men coming off guard duty, Ute women who had helped through the day, neighbors who had brought supplies all joined hands in a circle. The first night, Miriam's voice shook as she began to pray aloud. Lord, we come before you as your children, united in our need for your healing touch. But as the days passed, her prayers grew stronger, more confident. She found herself speaking not just for Charles's recovery, but for protection over them all, for wisdom in facing the troubles ahead, for unity between their peoples. Slowly, painfully, Charles began to improve. The fever broke on the fourth night. His breathing grew easier, and he managed to take spoonfuls of broth. Color returned gradually to his face, though the bruises still painted his skin in violent shades. Miriam caught glimpses of herself sometimes, reflected in the window glass or her neighbor's eyes. She hardly recognized the woman she saw there, this capable, determined person who directed the homestead's defense, coordinated care for her husband, and led evening prayers without hesitation. She remembered the humiliated woman at the auction block, convinced no one could truly want her. That woman felt like a stranger now. In her place stood someone new, a woman whose strength others relied upon, whose faith helped carry them all through dark days. One evening, as she spooned broth carefully between Charles's lips, he caught her hand. His grip was stronger now, his gaze clear despite the lingering bruises. God knew, he said softly. He knew exactly what kind of heart this home would need. Miriam felt tears well up, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. She looked around the cabin, at Aina grinding herbs by the hearth, at young Jim standing guard outside the window, at the neighbors gathered for evening prayers. This was her place. These were her people. And she would continue to hold them up with every ounce of strength God granted her. A week after the attack, Charles managed to sit upright in bed for the first time. Though his face remained mottled with fading bruises, determination burned in his eyes. The water channel, he said, voice stronger than it had been in days. They will try again if we don't fix it properly. Miriam nodded, already formulating a plan. Then we'll make it right. All of us together. She spent that evening sending word through both communities. Young Jim rode to the Amish households, while Ahiana's grandson carried messages to the Ute camps. By dawn the next morning, a mixed group had gathered outside the cabin. Amish men in their dark coats, Ute workers with tools slung across their backs, and even a few uncertain townspeople drawn by curiosity. Miriam stepped onto the porch, her heart hammering but her voice steady. The channel feeds all our lands. Today we make it whole again. The work began under the cool morning sun. Miriam organized teams to haul timber from the sawmill, clear debris from the damaged sluice, and rebuild the broken sections. She worked alongside them all, her strong shoulders straining as she helped carry heavy boards. Sweat soaked through her dress as the sun climbed higher. Her muscles burned, but she refused to stop. When younger men offered to take her load, she shook her head. Every hand is needed, she said firmly. Near midday, the sound of approaching horses made everyone look up. Railroad foreman Lasker rode in with 2 deputies, his face twisted in a sneer. Well, he called out, reining his horse to a stop. The fat sister's got herself an army of savages and plain folk, Miriam straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. The old shame tried to surface, but she pushed it down. With careful steps, she walked to stand before his horse. "These waters are protected by treaty," she declared, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent worksite. "The agreement was signed by your own railroad company, witnessed by the territorial governor himself." Lasker's sneer faltered slightly. He hadn't expected her to know the law. "God's justice sees no difference between peoples," Miriam continued, growing bolder. "This water feeds all our children, waters all our crops. Would you steal from your own neighbors for profit?" Movement caught her eye. Reverend Pike had arrived, drawn by the commotion. He stood listening, his weathered face thoughtful. "She speaks truth," the preacher called out suddenly, stepping forward. "I've seen that treaty myself. The railroad promised to respect these water rights." A murmur ran through the gathered workers. Several townsfolk who had stopped to watch shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement. Lasker's face darkened with rage, but he was outnumbered. After a tense moment, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away. His deputies following. Work resumed with renewed energy. Miriam's hands grew blistered from rough timber, but she barely noticed. Hour by hour, the channel took shape. Amish craftsmanship joined with Ute knowledge of the water's flow. Even a few townspeople set aside their prejudices to help. As the sun began to set, someone called out, "Water's coming through." Everyone gathered to watch as the first stream trickled down the repaired channel. The flow strengthened, running clear and true along its proper course. A cheer went up from the tired workers. Miriam's back ached fiercely, but triumph blazed in her heart. She looked around at the unlikely gathering, Amish Ute, and townsfolk standing together in the golden evening light, and felt God's presence in their unity. "All are welcome at our table," she announced. "There's stew enough for everyone who worked today." Soon the cabin filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Miriam served bowls of hot stew while Ayanna passed fresh bread. Children played together in the yard as adults sat sharing tales of the day's work. Charles watched it all from his chair by the fire, pride shining in his eyes. When Miriam finally sat beside him with her own bowl of stew, he reached for her hand. "Look what God has done through you," he said softly. Miriam squeezed his fingers, too moved for words. The cabin that had once felt so foreign now overflowed with fellowship. Her blistered hands and aching muscles were badges of honor, proof that strength could build bridges where hatred had tried to divide. Through the open door, she could see the water channel gleaming in the last rays of sunset, carrying its life-giving flow to all their lands. Just as God had intended, the first heavy snows of winter transformed the Colorado landscape into a blanket of pristine white. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, frost patterns decorating the cabin windows like delicate lace. Miriam helped Charles button his coat, her fingers gentle around the spots where bruises still lingered. Though he moved slower than before the beating, his strength had largely returned. "Are you certain you're well enough?" she asked, adjusting his collar. Charles caught her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "More than well enough to honor my wife before God and man. Honor my wife before God and man." The wagon ride to town was peaceful, their breaths forming clouds in the crisp morning air. Fresh snow creaked beneath the wheels as their horse plodded steadily forward. Miriam huddled close to Charles beneath the heavy quilts she had brought, grateful for his solid presence beside her. When they arrived at the white-painted church, Miriam noticed the difference immediately. No whispers followed their entrance. No sneers greeted her as she walked down the aisle on Charles's arm. The same congregation that had once mocked her size now watched in respectful silence as they took their usual pew. Ayanna and her grandson sat near the back, where they had begun attending services in recent weeks. The boy gave Miriam a small wave, which she returned with a warm smile. The sight of them there, accepted if not yet fully embraced, gave her heart a lift of joy. Reverend Pike's sermon, focused on God's mysterious ways of working good from hardship. His eyes met Miriam's several times as he spoke of how the Lord often chose unlikely vessels for his greatest works. She felt Charles's hand tighten around hers. As the final hymn concluded, Charles slowly rose to his feet. Miriam looked up at him in surprise as he kept hold of her hand, gently drawing her to stand beside him. The rustling of papers and quiet murmurs fell away as the congregation noticed them standing. "If I might speak," Charles said, his clear voice carrying to every corner of the church. Reverend Pike nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Brother Stoltzfus." Charles turned slightly to face the gathered people, his grip on Miriam's hand steady and sure. "When I came to this town, I prayed for God to guide me to a wife of true strength and character." Some of you questioned his answer. He paused, his eyes sweeping across faces that now looked down in shame. "But this woman beside me is God's perfect reply to my prayers." Tears began to sting Miriam's eyes as Charles continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She has shown courage when I faltered, wisdom when I doubted, love for all God's children when others turned away. Through her actions, she's wrought healing between peoples who were divided. Through her faith, she has helped restore justice where there was wrong." He looked directly at her then, his eyes shining. "She is my wife, my partner, and God's greatest blessing to me." Miriam could hardly see through her tears as Charles lifted their joined hands. "I thank God daily for leading me to her, and I ask his blessing on our life together." A profound silence filled the church. Then, one by one, heads began to bow in respect. Even those who had been her cruelest critics lowered their eyes in acknowledgement of God's wisdom in joining these two lives. From her place near the back, Ayanna smiled warmly, nodding in approval. Her grandson beamed at Miriam, no longer the sickly child she had helped save, but a strong boy growing in the peace she had helped forge. After the service, people approached them differently than before. Where once there had been mockery, now there were quiet words of appreciation. Where there had been sneers, now there were respectful nods. Miriam accepted their changed attitudes with grace, neither gloating nor holding on to old hurts. The ride home was peaceful, snow beginning to fall in thick, lazy flakes. Charles and Miriam spoke little, comfortable in the gentle silence between them. The landscape stretched pristine and white in every direction, like God had swept away all the ugliness of the past months with a clean blanket of snow. At the homestead, they worked together to settle the horse and wagon before heading inside. Miriam built up the fire while Charles brought in more wood, their movements in perfect harmony after months of sharing this space. The evening meal was simple: hot soup, fresh bread, and the last of the autumn preserves. They sat close together by the hearth, the crackling fire casting warm light across their faces. Outside, the snow fell steadily, but within their cabin, all was snug and peaceful. Miriam gazed at Charles across their supper bowls, her heart full to bursting. The man who had seen her worth when others laughed, who had given her not just his name, but his trust and respect, who had stood beside her through danger and triumph alike. But beyond even finding a husband, she had discovered so much more. She had found family in unexpected places, in Ayanna's steadfast friendship, in the children who now played freely around their cabin, in the unlikely community that had formed across old boundaries of culture and faith. She had found dignity, not in others' approval, but in standing firm for what was right. The woman once dismissed as the fat one had become a bridge between peoples, a voice for justice, a source of strength for others. Most precious of all, she had found peace. Peace in knowing her true worth. Peace in being exactly who God had made her to be. Peace in the quiet moments like this, sharing supper with the man who had recognized her strength from the start. The snow continued falling outside their windows, but Miriam had never felt warmer. Love filled every corner of their home. Love that had been tested by violence, strengthened through trials, and emerged pure and true as the driven snow. She reached across the table and took Charles's hand. No words needed between them. They had found in each other exactly what God intended. Not just marriage, but partnership. Not just acceptance, but celebration of who they were together. The woman once ridiculed as unwanted, now shone with quiet radiance, her inner beauty finally visible to all. Just as winter's snow transformed the landscape into something pristine and new, God's love had transformed her life into something more beautiful than she could have imagined. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.